we're over time, so without further ado, I'm going to say thank you to my co-facilitator George, as well as to all of our presenters, Patricia, Krishna, Catherine and Ihor, for today's session on working in other regions and development contexts. And I also have the pleasure to introduce our next session. So the next session is going to be on adapting prevention and response to male survivors, including children and adolescents. And the facilitators are two powerhouses from the child protection sector. We have Leisha Beardmore, Senior Advisor for Gender-Based Violence at Save the Children, and also the project technical lead for PRISM, which is a project working with LGBTQI+ children and their families in child protection case management in humanitarian settings. And we also have Susanna Davies, who's a Senior Humanitarian Advisor for interagency child protection at Save the Children, and she's also the co-lead of our child protection minimum standards working group at the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. So over to you, Leisha and Susanna, for the next session.
Fantastic. Am I coming through okay in sound? Great.
Yes, you are.
Great. My Wi-Fi has been playing up a little bit this morning, of course. So I'm going to turn off my video, but just to start with, to say good afternoon, everyone. It's lovely to be here with you all. So yeah, I'll turn off my video just to save bandwidth. So today and over the next session, we're going to be hearing from Precious from ICRC and Marzia from the Danish Refugee Council. Precious is the manager for addressing sexual violence with the ICRC in South Sudan, and their presentation will look at the prevention, mitigation and response continuum concerning sexual violence in South Sudan and how men and boys are uniquely impacted by sexual violence in the conflict. With considerations surrounding stigma and access to holistic services, we will be invited to explore the question of how and where men and boys fit into these systems of support that are currently available. Following on from this, we will hear from Marzia and their experiences within the Danish Refugee Council in Uganda, Kenya and Tanzania. Marzia works as a protection coordinator in Uganda, however will speak to the learnings from DRC across the region, sharing with us the key findings, trends and gaps related to GBV support, specifically impacting men and boys, as well as more broadly supporting LGBTQI+ survivors. After these two presentations, we can then come back together and hear any questions from the audience and participants, and to create that space for discussion between panelists and attendees. So many thanks to Camilla, George, and all the organisers for making this space possible. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to Precious for their presentation. Thanks, Precious.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be part of this session today. Quite interesting session since the morning began. Can you hear me? Maybe just the
yes, that's great.
Check. Okay, great. So very quickly, because we don't have a lot of time, I would be focusing in my presentation today, speak a little bit about what we do as the ICRC, our response, like you mentioned earlier, the prevention, mitigation, response approach, but as well as also speaking a little bit about two research we did focusing on men. The first one really looking at men as victims and survivors, and the second one looking at men as potential perpetrators, but also people who could influence and contribute to sexual violence prevention in their communities. I would end with a little bit on sexual violence in detention, focusing on boys, but also looking at access to services and some of the barriers to accessing services for men and boys, and I will conclude with a few recommendations. Next slide, please. Maybe just to say a note on our approach very quickly is the fact that our approach to addressing sexual violence is not just focusing on responding to the cases once they occur, but also to preventing them before they occur. I'm sure many people would agree that victims and survivors of sexual violence, including men and boys, definitely want to have access to services. They would appreciate being served. However, they don't even want to be victims in the first place. And this is where the importance of prevention really comes in, to stop it before it happens, or to mitigate the risk of it happening, and if it eventually happens, to respond in a holistic survival-centered approach. I just wanted to mention that our approach to working on sexual violence is not only focusing on the victims, but also the focus on working with weapon bearers, including those who could be potential perpetrators. So on the victim side, we carry out a range of services, which I will not have time to go into details. But also when we work with potential perpetrators, as well as authorities, stakeholders, and every other person apart from victims, we also look at supporting the development of the law, including standards and norms in detention settings. Next slide, please. Just to make a point on intersectionality, and I know quite a number of points have been made earlier in the day, to say that from our perspective, vulnerability is not automatic, it's not inherent. We've heard earlier in the morning of how it's really challenging when we talk about men and boys being victims of sexual violence. Traditionally, the focus has really been on women and girls, and that's important, and there's a logic to that, because sexual violence is really a gender phenomenon, but this also then ignores the specific vulnerabilities of men and boys. And this is also linked to, as we've said earlier on, social stigma, social norms around masculinity. Therefore, it's important that when we are looking at the issue of sexual violence, we apply the intersectional approach, which really looks at not just the strength, but also the vulnerability and the personal identity and circumstances of each individual involved. Next slide, please. So just maybe to go now right into the core of the presentation is to highlight two research that we did, focusing on men and boys. The first one in conflict setting, and this research was done together with the Norwegian Red Cross in 2001, and it looks at the challenges and the barriers and the gaps impacting men and boys in humanitarian emergencies, including in detention settings. Next, please. And the main point to take away is that from this research, it looks at the prevalence and the incidence, and it really goes back to all what has been said earlier on in different presentations, and the fact that the scale is still unknown, and it's linked to several factors on the reporting, social stigma, social norms, and all of that. But even when it was investigated, the numbers were higher than thought. For example, one of the findings of the report showed that 1 in 5 males in detention settings reported having experienced sexual violence. There are also other figures on the slides, which I will not have time to go into details. But what I also wanted to highlight, that one of the challenges when it came to understanding the scale of the phenomenon of sexual violence against men and boys, especially when it comes to reporting, was that it's not just that it was only underreported, it was also miscategorized. And by this I mean that either due to the shame or the stigma, or just the sheer lack of awareness of what constitutes sexual violence, there's common types of sexual violence that were committed against men in conflict settings, such as forced nudity, forced witnessing, forced perpetration. We are not routinely recognized as such, and therefore will not be reported. And even a service provider, some instances did not routinely recognize this, and so this was also a challenge in terms of accessing services for men and boys. And we'll talk about younger boys in particular. The main risk highlighted here was really linked to risk of sexual exploitation and abuse imposed on children by older adults. Next, please. The second research speaks to male perceptions. Now, this was conducted specifically in South Sudan and Central African Republic. This research looks at men, but also included women and humanitarian actors more broadly, members of the community. But the idea was to look at what men thought about what sexual violence is, what causes sexual violence, and how sexual violence can be prevented. In terms of understanding of sexual violence, whilst from the perspective of women and girls, sexual violence was talked about as something that was inevitable. So it was not a matter of if, it was a matter of when. However, when we spoke about sexual violence against men and boys, this was not routinely understood or identified. Sometimes it was even laughed about. And this is really linked to issues around masculinity, social norms, and how society construes men in terms of being victims of sexual violence. Another thing that was highlighted in terms of the understanding of sexual violence was that rape in sexual relationship was not routinely described as, within relationships or within marriage, was not routinely described as sexual violence. Now, to the specific causes of sexual violence, maybe one thing to highlight was the fact that we saw a difference in the perception of the men in the community compared to key informants from the humanitarian actors, in the sense that most of the community members linked the cause of sexual violence to external factors or drivers such as guns, alcohol, unemployment, rather than individual perpetrator behavior. And finally, when it came to preventing sexual violence, while many of the research participants actually were willing and saw the need for prevention, especially in the community, there were not so much recommendations in terms of what they could do or how they could contribute to this prevention. However, that's changed when we went back to the community to provide feedback to the community on the findings and the results from the research. So this, during the validation workshops, this gave the community the opportunity to really reflect on the research and the findings, and they were able to make more concrete proposals in terms of what they could do, how they, especially the men, how they envision their own roles within their community when it comes to preventing sexual violence. And one of the initiatives that came out from that dialogue and engagement with the community during the feedback sessions was intergenerational dialogue, where older men in the community had requested the ICRC to facilitate intergenerational dialogues with younger men, and we were able to support the communities to do this. And as a result of that, the younger men also took up that responsibility and wanted to take the message further to other younger men in the cattle communities. And this led to another session between younger men, peer-to-peer exchange. So the younger men who have benefited from the intergenerational dialogue were now the ones facilitating sessions with their peers. There are so many other things we did, but I just wanted to highlight this in terms of how we could use research to engage communities in a meaningful way, to really take the lead when it comes to sexual violence prevention in their communities. Next, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. Just to say a little bit on sexual violence against boys in detention. Next slide, please. First, when we talk about sexual violence occurring in detention settings, it does not occur in isolation. It's usually indicative of a dysfunctional system, either because of the power imbalance, the physical space, or the protocol or staffing issues. And boys are particularly more vulnerable when it comes to issues around sexual exploitation, like I mentioned before, or sexual services asked or imposed on children in exchange for food, money, or commodities. But it's also linked to the fact that children, boys in this context, may be forced to assist or even watch this kind of acts happening, especially in settings where adults and children are held together in the same space. This also makes it even easier for sexual violence to happen unsupervised. So in terms of the vulnerabilities, in terms of our work in detention, one thing I wanted to highlight is that we look at it within the context of our work on torture and ill treatment. What might appear to be a situation of torture, when we dig deeper, when you look into it, you might realize that it has elements of sexual violence. It might be a sexualized form of torture or ill treatment, like I was giving some examples before. However, due to lack of awareness or even knowing or recognizing this as a form of sexual violence, it goes unreported. And this is also complicated by the fact that it's even more challenging. So there are limited options for referrals and reporting within detention settings. Another point to note when it comes to detention, especially for boys and for men more broadly, is the fact that due to local customs and associated stigma, sometimes victims may well prefer to be identified as a victim of torture rather than as a victim of sexual violence. Next slide, please.
Precious, just to let you know, you've got 2 minutes.
Okay, so let's finish quickly. The next, please. When we talk about access to holistic services, yes, I cannot stress, the next slide, please. I cannot stress enough the need for services to be inclusive of men, and this theme has come up throughout the many sessions we've had. And I think the big question that we need to ask ourselves today is, how many organizations have mapped services that are inclusive of men? How many have mapped referral pathways that are inclusive and that can provide access to men? I think as humanitarian actors, as service providers, this is something that we also need to continue to pay attention to, because most times, for example, in many facilities, just to give an example where medical services are provided, are usually located in the maternity ward, and this might pose a challenge for men to access those services. In some countries, local laws do not even recognize men as victims of sexual violence, and this is also another challenge in terms of being able to access services or even being able to report sexual violence. The next. I think there's a couple of points, and then before we get to the next slide. Maybe just also note in terms of holistic services, especially when it comes to providing economic support, economic programs, cash and livelihood support. Many of these programs target female-headed households and do not necessarily look at men, and it's important to also pay attention to this. Next, please. There are quite a number of factors. This speaks to what could be the barriers, including in detention, and I've already started mentioning them, but maybe just to highlight 3 main points is the fact that when it comes to men and boys especially, they might face challenges linked to the inability to disclose, especially in detention settings, for example, where they may not be able to engage with the authorities, or they need some form of specialized people who are experts, like social workers, child welfare, who they could trust with that kind of information. Another point is also the fear of reprisal. In detention settings, for example, where the perpetrators are within the same facility, it poses really a big challenge for boys to be able to report. And finally, one of the big challenges when it comes to accessing services, especially in detention settings, is also the inability to access care in a place of detention where mental health and psychosocial support may not readily be available, legal support may not really readily be available, even medical support. So it's just to highlight that there are quite a number of factors, but the big ones really relate to the inability to disclose, the fear of reprisal, and the lack of access to care. And the final point, just to end on a note of recommendation from our side, and there, if you could please go to the next slide. There are 3 recommendations which we would like to highlight, but I would say for me the main takeaway from this session, because a lot has been said, is that in our work, how do we want to integrate the issue of sexual violence against men and boys? How do we want to integrate it? How do we want to ensure that men and boys have access to services in an inclusive manner? How are we mapping services? How are we mapping referral pathways? How are we sensitizing ourselves and the people we work with to be able to include this reflection? We spoke about the intersectional approach and all of that. I think we have quite a lot of resources, we have quite a lot of opportunity. The gap really lies in ensuring that we add this lens, in recognizing that men and boys, just like women and girls, can also be victims of sexual violence. As we have it today, the referral systems, service provision still exclude men and boys. So how do we think going forward in ensuring that men and boys do not continue to be excluded when it comes to access to services or even prevention of sexual violence? Thank you. Over.
Thank you so much, Precious. That was an incredibly interesting presentation, and thanks for all the work that you're doing. You managed to get through that so quickly at the end, so thank you so much for that. We're now going to hand over to Marzia from DRC who's going to share their experiences as well.
Hello, colleagues. Good afternoon. I'm so happy to be here, and thank you very much for giving this opportunity. So yes, I am here to represent DRC, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania to share our best practices and also how we have adopted our GBV services to male and boy survivors. Specifically, now I'm also at the end of my presentation. I will be looking more to hear from other participants to have their experiences, how we can adopt the GBV services for the boys and adolescent GBV survivors. Thank you. So the next slide, please. Thank you. So DRC is working in the East Africa and Great Lakes region over 2 decades now. We are present with protection services in 10 countries like Burundi, Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, South Sudan, Sudan, and also Djibouti. And these are the areas that we are present in providing protection services to displaced population, including IDPs, refugees, people on the move, as well as the host community members. Yes, next slide, please. Yes, DRC, so in Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya, the context is that DRC is present in Uganda since 1997. As I mentioned earlier, that we are the protection lead, as well as we are leading the Uganda Cash Consortium. And mainly our protection programming are being implemented in the northern Uganda, which is Rhino, Vepi, as well as we are implementing protection activities in Karianjongo and Lebole, and we are working closely with refugees and the host community members. So in Tanzania, my colleagues are working there since 2015, and we are also the protection lead and also CCCM actor in Tanzania. We are working mainly with refugees there in Duta and also in the refugees camps there, mainly the refugees who are coming from Burundi and Congo. So in Kenya, my colleagues are present there since 2005, and we are the main protection actor in the area, and we are working in Kakuma in Dadaab camp with GBV and also mainly protection activities in those areas. So definitely, like as we know, majority of the refugees who are living in Dadaab and Kakuma are coming from Somalia and also South Sudan. So next slide, please. Yes, so for the protection situation or protection trends in Uganda currently, so this is the figure of like that we have received it from the reporting.
What's the budget line? What's the budget line?
So colleagues, would you mind to mute, please?
I mean, what's the budget line?
So there are some noise at the background.
Ask him everything. Just name it.
Nina, could you please mute?
Okay, sorry for that. So the over 3,000 GBV incidents have been reported from January up to end of August, unfortunately, in Uganda. So, and specifically in the previous slide, please. Yes, specifically in the refugee hosting districts, that the main GBV cases that have been reported are like social or emotional abuses, and denial of resources, physical assault, forced or child marriages, and the main GBV concerns related to like the main factors are its lack of access to like services, mainly reduction in the food, as well as reduction in the cash for the people who are receiving this cash assistance for food on monthly basis, and also lack of access to enough land for farming. So mainly these are the factors that have led to the GBV incident, which is over 3,000 incidents so far. So yeah, mainly the women and girls are reported being as a survivor of GBV, but we also have some limited cases that we have received as a survivor are men and boys also, that I can discuss in the coming slides. The next slide, please. So yes, in Kenya, because my colleagues are also present, as I said, for protection activities in Kenya. So in addition to the vulnerabilities, now, unfortunately, climate change also have added to more the vulnerability and also to the risks that women and girls are facing in the refugee sites like Kakuma and Dadaab. The main GBV types that reported in those contexts are sexual exploitation, sexual harassment, physical and sexual abuse, domestic violence, including the intimate partner violence, child marriage and forced marriage, as well as the female genital mutilation. These are the GBV cases that have been reported in Kenya. So then the main factor that is contributing to the GBV incident in Kenya, specifically in Dadaab and Kakuma, are like strains in the household economic situation, lack of access to the sustainable livelihood, as well as the harmful tradition or cultural norms that are available among the displaced population in that context. So the next slide, please. Yes, this slide is more about our activities and also information and trends in Tanzania. The most reported forms of GBV among refugees population in Tanzania are like sexual assault, including rape, physical assault, forced marriage, psychological and emotional abuses, and denial of resources, opportunities, and services. So the majority of survivors, definitely it has been reported as a women and girls are the majority of survivors, but we also have some very limited number of cases which are like male and boy survivor. The main contributing factor in Tanzania context are like alcoholism and drug abuses. So conflict at the household level, conflict or tension at the household level, as well as the polygamy and lack of access to proper shelter. These are the issues that have contributed to lead to more GBV incidents in that context. The next slide, please. Yes, so then this is like men and boys are the, as I said, that it's not only like women and girls, though women and girls are majority of the survivor of GBV in the three contexts that GRC is at the moment that we are working, and I'm sharing the experiences, but we also have very limited number of like cases that there are men and boys as survivor. So majority of GBV survivor. Then when it comes to the men, definitely our best practices are how we are going to respond to their needs, because it's different from one country to another country. For example, in Tanzania, my colleagues as a best practices, they have set up a desk, a GBV case management response, or like small desk within our general protection desk in the refugee camps in order to be able to respond to the needs of male survivor. For example, in Uganda, we have our male action groups that they are more active, providing awareness raising to the males, to men and boys. That's how during those awareness raising, we identify the male and boy survivors. And it's a safe space for them to express their concerns. Though it's definitely it's a stigma in every context so far that the men and boys, they are not able or they are not feeling comfortable to express the concerns or to express that they are the GBV survivors. But these are the best practices that we are using in order to be able to facilitate this opportunity for the male and boy survivor to express their concerns and seek assistance when they are experiencing gender-based violence. So then we are still trying to see how better we can adopt our programming, that it would be more friendly and more responsive to the men and boys survivors, that they would be more encouraged not to keep quiet and they could seek assistance in terms of like to be supported. So we are still trying and we see how things are moving forward. So yes, the next slide, please. Yeah, so as we are aware that the LGBTQ plus specifically, I think we can even go to the next slide because we already spoke about this slide. The best practices. Is still the next slide, please, because we spoke about it. So yes, we also like other best practices that I mentioned that in Uganda we have the male action group that we through their support, through their presence in the community, we provide awareness raising for the men about the GBV situation and also the available services in terms of GBV, so that how they can report, how they can seek assistance, and how they can receive these services in a very safe place. So, for example, in Kenya, also DRC works with the community leader to foster the greater acceptance of like LGBTQ plus I communities, because it's not only like stigma is not only for the male survivor of GBV as well as the boy survivor of GBV, but LGBTQ plus are another like vulnerable groups that we have in this context. Mainly our colleagues in Kenya is working with them, so that I will present their services also in the next slide. So yes, the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so case management services for LGBTQ plus survivors. So we, as I mentioned, it's only in Kenya that DRC is providing GBV services for LGBTQI plus group. So we have comprehensive GBV case management, including referral to other partners in a very safe manner in order to keep the confidentiality as well as to avoid any causing harm. So we also provide PSS to this group and also through our trained staff members, because we have dedicated staff member to work with this specific group. Still, it's based on the interest of the every client, that if they are more comfortable to work with the female staff members, or they are more comfortable to work with male staff members, but we have ensured that all our staff members, they are capacitated and they have been trained, and they are able to provide these case management services to the LGBTQ plus group. So we also do provision of individual counseling and group therapy for the LGBTQ plus in Kenya. So then we also do a lot of engagement with our partners through awareness raising session, as well as we are working closely with the community members and community leaders in order to be able to engage them also to support LGBTQ plus in their community, and also to accept them in the community, specifically when it comes to the reintegration back in the community. So we work closely with the community leaders to facilitate these services and opportunity for LGBTQ plus to live in the community, and also to receive all this support from the community members. The next slide, please. So still with the case management services for LGBTQ plus and survivors in Kenya, as I mentioned, we provide support through group and also linking them with the social cohesion and livelihood opportunities, because we know that it's still a stigma among the community members, but we want to make sure that this group have access to the services, as well as they have access to the livelihood opportunities in order to continue their life and have earning also for their life. Provision of awareness raising session and facilitating dialogues among the community members and also among the community leaders to foster the good relationship with the larger community members, because this group have been experiencing some challenges in terms of being accepted in the community. So these are the best practices and the initiatives that we have in place in order to be able to support this specific group, that they also should be able to receive support from the community members. The next slide, please. Yeah, so when it comes to the male and child and adolescent survivor of GBV, so unfortunately, we do not have enough cases so far for this specific group. As I mentioned earlier, that majority of the GBV survivors that have been reported are women and girls, and we also have limited cases of male survivor and boys. But when it comes to the male child and adolescent survivors, so far we do not have a lot of cases. There could be so many reasons. Probably there is not much attention in the humanitarian context in Uganda to this group, that there are also there are male child and adolescent GBV survivors. So now this is an opportunity that I could hear more from other colleagues to share their experiences, that how better we can adopt within DRC our programming to be able to identify this specific group. Definitely there must be survivor at this age group in the community, but so far we are not identifying this group actively. So it could be that probably the services are not adapted based on the needs of this specific group. There also could be, for example, that we have very gender segregated services. For example, we have like women and girl friendly spaces that it's from, even from the name, it's so clear that it's for women and girls. So probably these groups or the male survivors even cannot dare, or it's due to stigma or due to so many reasons that they have, they're not very encouraged to come and seek assistance. So probably there also could be other reasons that it is possible, specifically for Uganda context, probably there has not been a lot of attention or a lot of donor focus also on these specific groups, that how better like organizations in the humanitarian, specifically protection service provider, how better they could adopt their services and also their approach in order to be able to identify these like male, child and adolescent GBV survivors, as well as provide services based on their needs, as well as so based on the, you know, like context, because it's so sensitive and it is sad that these people have been left behind, that we are not having enough attention to this group. So how better we can respond. I will be very happy to hear from other colleagues to share their experiences, that what could be the best option, what could be the best practices that we also could use within DRC to adopt our programming. Yes, I think this is it from my side.
Fantastic. Yes. Thank you so much, Marzia. And you finished on perfect time. So thank you so much for that as well, and for the great presentation. So this leads us into 5 minutes of discussion time. And again, thanks to both Precious and Marzia for those really interesting shares. So the first question that has come up from Tim in the chat was, speaking of Uganda, how does the new legal regime complicate working with male survivors or victims? So I think, Marzia, that's probably a question for you, but also for both of you.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. So if I understood the question, probably it's more focusing on the LGBTQ+I group, specifically the recent law and regime about the LGBTQ+, if I'm not mistaken. Because this
the question was around male survivors. So it was around male survivors or victims. So I guess that would be both within the LGBTQI+ community and then assumed as well.
Yeah, so for the general population, I could say that the male survivors, so far it's like we have not faced any challenges with that. So those people that, like the cases that we have identified are like based on the awareness raising that we have provided them, and we have provided this information, and we have facilitated the opportunities for them to come and seek assistance based on their needs. So far we have not faced any challenges in that term. But when it comes to the specific LGBTQ+I community, so then so unfortunately due to that like legal situation and the laws that are in place, so far we are not working in Kenya to respond to the needs of this individual, and also we have not received a case from this specific group. So yeah, but our colleagues in Kenya is so far within DRC, we have only these services in Kenya, but in Uganda we have not, to be honest, we have not received even a single case within DRC.
Great, thank you so much, Marzia. That was really helpful. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to share? I'm going to open the floor and see if anyone, I can't see any other questions in the chat, but if any other comments would like to ask a question, please do so. Otherwise, I will. Yeah. Okay, I'll ask a question from my side then. So this is a question for both you, Marzia, and for Precious. So I think it's been really interesting over the course of today to learn and see these kind of trends popping up across different presentations. And I was just wondering, thinking specifically around the LGBTQI plus space, either individuals who identify as LGBTQI plus or who have assumed identities within that group, what would you say in terms of key takeaways or recommendations that you would want donors and other international organizations and local organizations to be thinking of as one or two of the key takeaways in terms of best ways to kind of think about support?
Thank you. So I would take the opportunity to reply this to answer this question. So based on our experience working with this group in Kenya, the best practice would be like definitely there could be an opportunity for more funding if there is no funding at the moment. For example, earlier last year we had more funding and we were able to respond to the wider need of this group. But with the reduction of funding, unfortunately, we are trying to squeeze our current resources to respond to the needs of this population. Definitely the needs are different. Some of the clients from these specific groups would like to be resettled in other country, but definitely it's also not an option. But within the current context of Uganda that we are present, more funding would be a proper respond to the needs of this specific group. For example, now within our context, we're trying to squeeze our funding to respond to the needs of a specific group because it needs a lot of work. We have to have dedicated staff members. We have to have very capacitated staff members. We have to have more funding to engage other partners in terms of training them on how they could respond to the needs of this group. We also need more funding to engage the community members, because when we have enough resources, we will be able to respond appropriately to the needs of this population, and also we will be able to identify more of clients from this specific group. So definitely, I think this is something that we could advocate more to the donors to focus on this specific group, because especially now with legislation in Uganda, majority based on the conversation that we had within DRC. But so many people from Kenya have moved from Uganda have moved to Kenya. So it means that the number of those groups are increasing in Kenya. So specifically in those GBV camps. So how better we can respond? I think with the better resources, we will be able to respond to the needs. Now the floor is open to other colleagues because the question was also raised to Patricia.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Precious, over to you.
Yes, thanks. From my side, I think there's been a lot said about understanding the phenomenon of sexual violence against men and boys. Earlier on in the morning, it was mentioned that what we know is only a tip of the iceberg. So I would say that there is still a lot of work to be done to contribute to the global evidence. And I think there will be opportunities to be able to support more operational research to continue to understand the issue, the barriers in different contexts, the nuances. And linked to that would also be that there is also an opportunity to continue to work on land policy. We've seen that there's a lot of barriers in law and policy gaps, including where sexual violence against men and boys, including sexual minorities, is not recognized. So there's a lot of work that can be done there. And I think donors, international community partners would have a key role to play in terms of influencing on policy, but also continue to contribute to the global evidence that will help to address the issue.
Thank you. That's such a helpful response. Thank you so much, Precious. So we have one more question in the chat, which, because I recognize we're just heading over time, I will say this is the question that's been raised. If either of you have any kind of quick last thoughts before we hand back to Camilla, and that is it possible to use some of the best practices that are being used by the HIV prevention sector to incorporate this into our work in GBV and child protection? So I don't know if Marzia or Precious, if either of you have any thoughts on that, please do share. And if not, we can respond in the chat and hand back over to Camilla.
Maybe what I would just say is that, well, it's possible, but I would say we also need to be careful because responses should be contextualized. I remember when we did the operational research on male perceptions, one of the suggestions that the communities made was to also integrate key messages, sensitizations around sexual violence into community health initiatives, including HIV prevention. So this is something that came from the communities themselves. So I think when applying these approaches, it's also good to localize them, to contextualize them and see what works in order to be able to provide like tailored responses to specific contexts. So that would be my thought.
Fantastic, that's really helpful. And Marzia, any last thoughts from you? And just a huge thanks to both of you again for all your time and support on this.
Thank you. So I agree with my colleague that she already mentioned that, yeah, it's really depending on the context, that what is applicable in every context. Some of the best practices are applicable in one context, in some contexts it's not. In order to avoid causing any further harm, so the best practice would be analyzed to see what could work better for the community. And when it comes from the community, definitely, because they have more like their coping mechanism, specifically positive coping mechanism should be put in place, that what better works for them. So based on the context, that we can see what will work better. Thank you. Over to you.
Thanks so much to both of you and to everyone for creating this space. It was wonderful to learn from both of you today, and I'm really grateful that you chose to share your experience with us. So Camilla, over to you, and thanks again.
Thank you so much to our session 7 facilitators and speakers. It was fascinating again, and adding another dimension for us to all reflect on. I believe I'm now introducing the next session, which takes us to a little bit of a shift in focus for today. I don't know, Christine, you were going to come in here. I was presenting this one. I was just going to say, I'll hand to you in a sec then. I was just going to say it's presenting a little bit of a shift in focus today. The sessions so far this morning have focused on mainly on boys as survivors and sexual violence affecting boys. And now we're moving to a focus on working with boys to address sexual violence affecting women and girls. So I'll hand to Christine to introduce this session, and thanks very much to the last session.